The plane taxied down the runway, its engines roaring as it gained speed. Carter sat in his seat, 17C, and fastened his seatbelt. He had always loved flying, the feel of takeoff, the sensation of weightlessness as the plane lifted off the ground. But today, he felt a sense of unease. He had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a much-needed break from the stress of work and everyday life. But as he settled into his seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the plane leveled off, the flight attendants began their safety demonstrations. Carter listened intently, his eyes scanning the cabin. The plane was mostly full, with a few empty seats scattered throughout. He noticed a man sitting in first class, sipping a glass of champagne. The man looked out of place, his worn jeans and faded t-shirt a stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings. The flight attendants finished their demonstration and began to make their way down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Carter declined, preferring to wait until the plane had reached its cruising altitude. As he waited, he pulled out his book and began to read. The hours passed slowly, the plane hitting turbulence several times. Carter felt a sense of relief when the pilot announced their descent. He closed his book and began to gather his belongings. As the plane touched down on the runway, Carter felt a sense of excitement. He was finally here, in a new city, ready to start his adventure. But as the plane taxied to the gate, Carter's excitement began to fade. The man from first class stood up, stretching his arms and yawning. He caught Carter's eye and smiled, a smug look on his face. Carter felt a surge of annoyance, but pushed it aside. He was here to enjoy himself, not to let some stranger ruin his trip. As the plane came to a stop, the doors opened and the passengers began to disembark. Carter waited patiently, letting the people in front of him exit the plane. When it was finally his turn, he stood up and made his way to the aisle. But as he reached the front of the plane, he was stopped by the flight attendant. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice firm but polite. "But I need to ask you to step aside." Carter was taken aback. "What's going on?" he asked, feeling a sense of confusion. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at the man from first class. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," she said. "This gentleman was supposed to have the window seat." Carter felt a surge of anger. "I have my ticket right here," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm supposed to be in seat 17C. The flight attendant looked at the phone, then back at Carter. "I apologize, sir," she said. "But I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat." Carter was stunned. He had never been asked to move from his seat before, and he couldn't understand why this was happening now. He looked at the man from first class, who was watching the scene with a smug look on his face. "I'm not moving," Carter said, his voice firm. "I have my ticket, and I'm staying in my seat." The flight attendant looked taken aback. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir," she said. "You're going to have to move to a different seat." Carter felt a sense of defiance. He was not going to back down, not without a fight. He pulled out his phone and began to dial a number, his heart racing with anticipation. This was going to be a long and difficult battle, but he was ready to fight. Chapter 2. The Storm Brewing. Carter's thumb hovered over the dial button. The weight of the moment, thick with the awkward silence of the boarding gate and the hushed expectations of surrounding passengers, pressed against his chest. He needed to reach out. He knew who to contact, who had the power to cut through the red tape and the pretense. But a stubborn part of him, a part that had been pushed aside one too many times, hesitated. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about principle. It was about the invisible lines that were so often drawn, the unspoken expectations that relegated some to second-class citizenship, even at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant, her name tag reading Sarah, shifted uncomfortably. The practiced smile she'd worn a moment before was now strained, replaced by a flicker of what might have been regret, or perhaps just the weary resignation of someone caught between protocol and a brewing storm. Beside her, the man from first class, the one with the smug smile and the air of entitlement, crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed, a silent challenge in his stance. "Sir, please," Sarah began, her voice tight, "we can offer you another seat. It may not be in this section, but—" Carter cut her off, his voice calm, deliberate. "I paid for this seat. I intend to use it." He held her gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the situation or by the implied threat of escalation. This was a game he knew well, a dance of power and pretense. He'd seen it played out in boardrooms, on city streets, and now, apparently, in the confined space of a commercial airliner. He was tired of playing by their rules. He lowered his phone. He could hear the subtle buzz of the cabin, the whispers and rustling of nervous passengers, the the metallic scent of the jet fuel and the stale air. It was all a pressure cooker, and the heat was slowly rising. He could feel the tension building, the weight of anticipation settling on his shoulders. He was the eye of the storm, and for this storm will be different. The man from first class chuckled, a dismissive sound that grated on Carter's nerves. "Come on, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't make a scene. It's just a seat." Carter ignored him, focusing on Sarah. He saw the subtle shift in her eyes, the quick glance towards the cockpit. She was weighing her options, calculating the potential fallout. He understood her position. He knew what pressure she was under. He knew how the system worked. But still he didn't move. Then, as if on cue, another flight attendant appeared. Younger, more assertive, with the eager confidence of someone who hadn't yet been worn down by the realities of the job. He was a stark contrast to Sarah. "Sir," the new attendant began, his voice edged with a forced patience, "we really need you to move. There's been a mistake. We have a policy for priority passengers." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "This seat wasn't meant for you." The words hung in the air, laced with an unspoken assumption, a subtle assertion of power. The unspoken words were louder. The unspoken rules, the unspoken expectations, were now laid bare. Carter was being told, in the most polite and professional way possible, that he didn't belong. He was the outlier, the inconvenience, the one to be removed to make way for someone more privileged. The young attendant's words resonated in the small space, amplifying the silence. It was a simple sentence, yet it was a statement that cut through the layers of politeness, the veneer of professional courtesy. This seat wasn't meant for you. It was a declaration of class, of priority, a subtle but unmistakable assertion of power. Carter stared at the young attendant, a storm churning within him. He felt the familiar sting of injustice, the quiet fury of the underdog. He was tired of playing the game. He was tired of the unspoken rules, the subtle indignities, the constant reminders that he wasn't quite good enough. He took a deep breath and slowly lowered his phone. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. He looked at the man from first class. The man's smile had widened, his eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that bordered on gloating. He knew he was in the right. He knew he had the advantage. "Who are you?" Carter asked, his voice quiet, deliberate. He wasn't sure what he was doing, he wasn't sure where this was leading, but he was tired of being the passive observer, the one to be told where he did or didn't belong. The man chuckled again, a condescending sound that grated on Carter's nerves. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "I just need this seat." Carter met his gaze, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He could feel the tension in the air, the palpable sense of something breaking. He knew that he was on the verge of something, a confrontation, a revelation, something that would change the trajectory of his trip. He could hear the nervous whispers, the furtive glances, the subtle shuffles of feet. He could feel the weight of the expectant audience. "It matters to me," Carter replied, his voice steady. "It matters why you are so entitled that you deserve a seat that isn't yours." The man's smile faltered. He was used to getting his way, to the effortless acquiescence of those around him. He wasn't used to being challenged. He shifted uncomfortably, his facade of nonchalance beginning to crack. The young attendant cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, please, let's not make this any more difficult than it has to be." Carter ignored him, focusing on the man. "What's your name?" he repeated, his voice unwavering. He had the feeling that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about something bigger, something more profound. It was about the subtle but pervasive ways in which the world was structured, the silent hierarchies that governed everything. The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the cabin. He seemed to realize that he had been exposed, that the illusion of his power was beginning to crumble. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he stopped, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and frustration. "Fine," he said, his voice a low growl. "My name is Victor. Now, can we just get this over with?" Carter nodded slowly, his eyes locked on Victor's. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of anticipation. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment when the world was about to tilt. He turned to the flight attendants. "And what is this so-called policy?" The young attendant stepped forward, a practiced smile returning to his face. "It's standard procedure, sir. For certain members." He trailed off, the words hanging in the air, heavy with implications. We have a policy to ensure a smooth flight experience for our... He paused again, searching for the right words. Priority passengers. Carter wasn't buying it. Priority? Is that what we are calling it now? Who exactly are these priority passengers? He glanced at Victor, his eyes conveying his unspoken thoughts. Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He opened his mouth to retort, but Carter cut him off. And what exactly makes you a priority passenger, Victor? Carter asked, his voice laced with a controlled sarcasm. Are you a movie star? A CEO? A member of the royal family? Victor bristled, his face flushed with anger. That's none of your business, he snapped. It is my business, Carter countered. Because I'm sitting in the seat that you believe is rightfully yours, and I want to know why. He turned to the flight attendant. Does it matter where I'm going? Does it matter if I have a family waiting for me, or if I have a life-changing business deal that's on the line? The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. The scene had become a spectacle, attracting the attention of the entire cabin. People craned their necks, whispering and speculating, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The air crackled with tension, as thick as the smog over a major city. And then, the crack finally appeared. As if on cue, a blinding flash of light erupted from the overhead compartment, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The plane lurched violently, throwing passengers from their seats. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and chaos erupted. The carefully constructed order of the cabin dissolved into pandemonium. This was far more than the usual turbulence. This was different, a violent jolt. This was something else entirely. And with the sudden, violent change, everything changed. The priority, the seating arrangement, the unspoken rules, all of it was now irrelevant. The game had shifted, and the stakes were no longer a seat on a plane. They were about to enter a different game entirely. The flight attendant screamed and the screams of the passengers began to fill the air, as the plane began its descent, not to the destination but to a world unknown. The plane bucked again, a sickening drop that slammed Carter against his seatbelt. The screams intensified, a cacophony of fear and panic that drowned out the blaring alarms. Through the porthole, the familiar blue sky was fractured by streaks of blinding light. It was a light unlike any he'd seen before, a celestial dance of violet and gold that seemed to rip at the fabric of reality. The crack, the initial shock, had altered something within the plane's structure. The overhead compartments, once securely locked, were spewing their contents. Oxygen masks swung down, swaying like mournful sentinels. Victor, his face ashen and his eyes wide with terror, was desperately fumbling for his mask. Carter, though shaken, found a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. He'd always been good in a crisis, his mind operating with a cold, detached clarity. He helped the flight attendant who was nearest to him with her mask. She, like the passengers, looked at him with a look of gratefulness in her eyes. "We need to stay calm," he shouted over the din. "We need to follow the instructions." It felt absurd, almost comical, to be offering advice in this situation, but something inside him refused to surrender to panic. The plane continued its violent descent, the world outside the windows turning into a blur of colors. The engine sputtered and coughed, the familiar drone replaced by a horrifying groan. It was clear they weren't going to make a controlled landing. Then, with a final, bone-jarring jolt, the plane slammed into the ground. The cabin plunged into darkness, the screech of metal against metal echoing in Carter's ears. He felt a searing pain in his arm and a crushing weight against his chest. The world tilted, spun, and then, nothing. He woke to a throbbing pain, gasping for air. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something unfamiliar and metallic. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. The cabin was a mangled wreck. Twisted metal and shattered debris were strewn everywhere. People lay sprawled amongst the wreckage, some still and silent, others moaning in pain. He didn't recognize anyone at all. He forced himself to move, wincing as pain shot through his arm. He tried to get up and was soon up and standing. It was an effort, but he did it. He began to move, navigating through the debris, searching for survivors. The flight attendants lay still, the same was of the passenger. He found Victor, buried under a section of the fuselage, gasping for air. Without hesitation, ignoring the pain, Carter began to pull at the metal, desperate to free him. He managed to lever the debris aside, pulling Victor free. Victor was conscious, but badly injured. He was breathing, but his wounds were grievous. "We need help," Victor gasped. "I know," Carter replied, his voice grim. "Can you walk?" Victor shook his head weakly. Carter made a decision. He knew that he couldn't just sit there and wait for help that might never come. He was now alone, in the middle of what appeared to be a forest. He decided that he could now do what he had to. He picked up Victor, and slowly he began to carry him. As he stumbled out into the wreckage and then out from the plane, he looked up at the sky. He saw that the violet and gold had dissipated, leaving behind a sky of an impossible green, swirling with strange, luminous clouds. The air was different. It was charged, alive with an energy that hummed against his skin. It was as if the world had been remade, rewritten. As he moved through the wreckage, he found a path that led him out of the wreckage and into a forest unlike any he had ever seen. The trees were taller than anything he could imagine, and the leaves glowed with a soft, internal light. He laid Victor gently against the trunk of one of these trees, a tree that seemed to pulse with life. "We're not in Kansas anymore, Victor," he said, his voice low. Victor opened his eyes, a flicker of fear mixed with wonder in them. Where are we?" Carter didn't know. But as he looked at Victor, his fear began to dissipate. He knew one thing, that he was alive, that the storm had broken, and that he was facing a new beginning. The unspoken rules, the invisible lines, the petty power games, were gone. Everything that he knew to be true had been shattered. And in the ruins, a new world was waiting to be explored. He looked at Victor and he thought, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that we're here. And we're going to survive." He was no longer just a man trying to get a seat. He was a survivor, standing at the edge of an unknown world, ready to face whatever lay ahead. His hand went to Victor's. And a new story was just beginning. The journey was about to begin.